This morning's reading was written by Victoria Safford, and some of you may have seen her name in UU circles. She's a minister in Minnesota, and she's somebody I think all of us would like to hang out with. And I did talk with her on the phone once, and she's terrific, and she's very funny, I think. So sit back and enjoy this one. Who do you think you are? She says, so last Sunday, when we were all singing Amazing Grace, we got to that bizarre moment in the first verse where our Unitarian Universalist hymn book slaps down an asterisk and a choice. What did you do? Which did you choose to sing? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, or that saved a soul like me. It probably depends on how you were feeling that day, how particularly wretched or soulful. I know of no other hymnal in print that virtually stops the singing in mid-measure to poll the congregation, to call for a theological debate within the mind and heart of every singer. And right there, quickly, because the pianist isn't going to wait for you, the congregation isn't going to wait for you, Sunday rolling on its way to Monday isn't going to wait for you. You have to stake your claim, make your mark, testify, all the while wondering if the person singing next to you will take offense if you confess at the top of your voice your own wretchedness and even our common condition as a fallen, faulty species. Or will your neighbor be annoyed or maybe shocked if you stand there warbling on about what a pleasant soul you are, what a nice, well-rounded, fully individuated, sin-free, guilt-free humanist soul. There you stand, frozen in time, and the music plays on while you hastily cobble a theology. We sing our song in different keys and cadences. We are on our own to make a faith out of nothing, which is to say, out of everything we have. That is daunting, lonely work, demanding and relentless work, the work of a lifetime. And I suspect it is the very scope of it that keeps our tiny movement small. Not everyone wants to stop singing in the middle of the song and consider once again and all alone the nature of the human soul and God, infinity without and infinity within. It's a lot to ask of people on a Sunday morning. Here ends our reading. Well, a summer ago, on a day during the last week of the summer, I was sitting outside the Fayre Beach store, chatting with a group of fellow ice cream eaters. I think Ruth Goldberg was one of them. One friend, Ruby McKay Nadeau, a longtime Fayre Beacher, asked me if I was going to do the Labor Day worship service, the last Sunday service of the season. I said I was, in fact, going to do the service, and Ruby graciously said, "Great, I'll come." And then she said something that took me aback. She said, "I hope you're not planning on singing Amazing Grace. You know, Amazing Grace is not a UU hymn." It's like, and I thought, I was stunned. I thought, what does she have, ESP? How did she know that I had already found the reading by Victoria Safford that we just heard? That reading was the hook I was going to use for my sermon. Once I recovered from my amazement that she had pounced on the one hymn I really wanted to sing that Sunday, I asked her why Amazing Grace isn't a UU hymn. And Ruby said, "We UUs believe that human beings have choices. Ruby is a longtime UU, and she knows her mind. She said, "We don't believe that some divine being from above will send down thunderbolts that will make everything all right. We believe that human beings have to decide the course for ourselves." That night, I called Ruby to make sure I had gotten the gist of what she said. I asked her if she would mind if I talked about our conversation in a sermon, and she said that I had understood what she said and that I could quote her. And of course, she didn't know I was going to quote her all over the Northeast, but here I am. That day at the ice cream store, I didn't get a chance to tell Ruby where I was going with my ideas about Amazing Grace. My goal was to talk about the goodness that is nurtured and, yes, even brought into being in religious communities like this church and Fayre Beach. I was thinking about how important our religious communities are, especially in the tough times we find ourselves today. And I had been thinking about how our vacations at Fayre Beach are more than vacations. Fayre Beachers talk about the magic of Fayre Beach, its restorative powers, its powers to heal our spirits, to help us pick ourselves up in low times, to help us find energy, the energy we had lost. You may feel this way about coming to the UU Church of Reading. And not just coming to worship services. I mean all the communal experiences that contribute to being part of this church. Back in Foxborough, we were a really small church, and I was in the choir. I was telling Sharon that I had to have roller skates to go back and forth. But I felt restored, totally renewed after every choir practice. Whatever that religious communal music magic is, it worked on me. So after my rather unsettling theological chat with Ruby, I was more determined than ever to find a way to tell her where I was going with my Amazing Grace ideas. I wanted to put the idea of communal magic into theological terms. And when I was in divinity school, I took a course in liberal theologies. Our professor, Paul Razor, led us through most of the liberal Christian theologies, including liberation theology. And I thought all of the liberal theologies were interesting, and I was glad that liberation theology gave indigenous people a way to make Christianity their own. But none of the liberal theologies spoke to my UU beliefs, none until we got to process theology. Have you heard of process theology? Process theology really embraces the UU principles, particularly the seventh principle, which affirms our place in the interdependent web. I should say as an aside, I really wish that process theology had a sexier name. That liberations theology sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But process? Anyway, that's what it's called. And here's how Paul Razor described process theology. The main tenet is that all that there is in the universe is a process with a capital P, and everything in the process is interrelated. Paul drew a big circle on the blackboard. Then he drew 4 small circles inside. And I'm making this pretty simple. He went on and on. One circle represented nature, which is random and over which we have no control. The second circle represented humanity, the third goodness, and the fourth evil. And here's the part I thought Ruby would like. In process theology, humans have choices. Excuse me. We can choose either goodness or evil. Paul drew arrows between the little circles in the big circle to illustrate the human choices. When we choose goodness, which we could call God or love, but this is not a requirement. In process theology, when we choose goodness, it is called creative goodness or creative good. I have a cup of water down here and I'm going to get it. Hold that thought. Didn't want you to think I was going to choke. Okay, so here's the last part. Sometimes, when we choose goodness, more goodness is generated than we thought our little choice could produce. Some process theologians see this generation of goodness, this unexpected bonus, as divine. I like to think of it as grace, a kind of participatory grace, not the thunderbolt kind. Those of us who were UUs in that liberal theology class were actually astounded to learn that there is a theology recognized by scholars that describes how we look at the world. We were thrilled that we could ascribe as much or as little of the divine to the process as fits our own belief system. And you won't be surprised to learn that there is an organization, of course there is an organization, called the UU Process Theology Network, which has many members and meets at GA and elsewhere. But I digress. Here is my message. I believe that when we come together in our UU communities, we find creative goodness. Excuse me again. This doesn't always happen to me. Sorry. I see church participation and retreats at Fayre Beach as complementary. Being a member of a congregation gives us year-round continuity, and coming to Fayre Beach for a church weekend or a week in the summer gives us an intensity of spiritual renewal we might not find if the experience were shorter. For 12 weeks every summer, people come to Fayre Beach to lay their burdens down, and every week I hear stories of creative goodness, stories of choices that lead to the grace of spiritual renewal. And here is one of those stories. A couple of summers ago, as program director, I had decided a second conference, a choral festival, should share the campus with Gala, our gay men's conference. The Gala brothers were not entirely happy about this because for many years they had had the campus to themselves. Fayre Beach had been their safe haven where they could be themselves. But their numbers were down, and we needed to fill the beach to pay the bills. I would say, just as an aside, that it's okay that their numbers were down because there was a time 34 years ago when there was no other place for gay men to go. And now there are many places to go. So it's okay if the Fayre Beach isn't the only place. So there had been some tension between the two conferences, mostly between the conference coordinators during the first summer. The second spring, I tried to get things smoothed out ahead of time through email negotiations. Silly me. The big area of contention had been chapel services. Gala has a 45-minute weekday chapel service every day. I thought the choral festival would want the more typical 15-minute weekday chapels so that they could have the full 3 hours for their morning workshops. None of my negotiations had resolved anything. At check-in day, I was still wringing my hands when something quite extraordinary happened. The two choral festival workshop leaders, Kathy Roshan and Mimi Bornstein, who wrote Comfort Me, by the way, and the Gala music director, David Tiedemann, all three potential divas, all wanted to know what the plans were for the Sunday worship and the chapel services. And I said, that's just it. We have no plans. The three of them went into our main building lobby, the Quillen lobby, to caucus. It was like the Camp David Accords. And I fully expected them to come to blows. In 20 minutes, they came back all smiles. They said they had solved the Sunday worship music situation. The Gala chorus and the choral festival choir would merge. And the three musicians, all three of them, would share the directing and accompanying. The next day, after the Sunday service and hearing Minister of the Week Howard Dana, the choral festival voted to go to the 45-minute chapels every day. Workshop leader Mimi Bornstein said to me that creating a community is more important than workshop time. As it turned out, the three musicians took turns teaching the combined choirs, now 75 to 80 people strong, and they learned 2 new pieces a day. The music was something to behold. One other thing happened that turned that week into a love fest. On the evening that the Gala brothers had their memorial walk from the Grove to the beach, the Grove is our wooded campground, had a walk to honor their deceased brothers. The choral festival left their evening singing. They felt frivolous singing show tunes with a solemn procession moving by. They went out and stood along the road, heads bowed in reverence. No one had ever done this before. This simple act meant more, and I would say this simple choice, meant more to the Gala brothers than anyone could have guessed. Later, they explained that when so many of their gay brothers died of AIDS some years back, their families had not acknowledged that they were gay, and gay friends and even partners had not been invited to the funerals and memorial services. No one had witnessed the loss of the friends that the friends and partners had suffered. But that night at Fayre Beach, the choral festival group had done just that. As the Gala brothers walked by, carrying their banner with dozens of names of Gala brothers who had died printed on it, the choral festival bore witness to their loss, and everyone wept. At the last worship service, during joys and concerns, people got up and talked about what the week had meant to them. Gala brothers said they hoped the choral festival and Gala would always share the week together, and the choral festival folks spoke of their appreciation and love for the Gala brothers. At the end, we were all crying. We don't always cry at Fayre Beach, but we sang, "How could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful?" and cried some more. David Tiedemann put his hands on my shoulders and he said, "Fayre, we didn't just get along, we honored each other. We honored each other." And these were choices. In our Fayre Beach microcosm, our intentional religious community, 2 cultures merged. They did not live side by side, just tolerating each other. They lived by our UU principles and affirmed each other. They found the grace to love each other. Today, as we celebrate creative goodness, the creative goodness of our UU communities, let us celebrate all of the places that help us smooth our rough edges. May we have the good fortune to return again and again to such communities of people who nourish our souls. I used to say that we go to church and retreat to Fayre Beach to recharge our batteries away from the humdrum demands of our everyday lives. But today, I think that is an understatement. One of our ministers of the week last summer said that the world outside of Fayre Beach seemed to be in chaos, and I think she was right. And I know I don't have to list for you all of the chaotic problems we have in our world. For us, Fayre Beach is more than a refuge from chaos. It is an affirmation that chaos cannot rule everywhere. Fayre Beach is where we discover the healing water of compassion. Right there in the thick of things at Fayre Beach, we discover the love that will not die. At Fayre Beach, as in this church, where moments of creative goodness abound, we are renewed in community. Together, whether we sing of being wretched or soulful, our hope is restored. Here ends our sermon for this morning.